Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows George "Bugs" Moran, the fierce rival of Capone, and a man whose grit, fire, and unbreakable will etch his name deep into Chicago's criminal history. Before we begin, make sure to like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes, and don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of George Moran guide you into the night. He was born Adelard Leo Kunin in St. Paul, Minnesota, to parents who brought their language, faith, and discipline from French-speaking roots. He moved through childhood under the watch of a Catholic parish, the kind where bells marked the hours and nuns kept order in classrooms. He did not grow up wealthy, and he did not take to the rules. By adolescence, he pushed against walls. Truancy turned into petty theft. Stolen watches, a knocked-over cash drawer, a quick escape through an alley, these were early steps. Police wagons learned his name. Judges sent him to short stints behind bars that were supposed to redirect him. Instead, he came out knowing harder faces and faster ways to get cash. By his late teens, Chicago called. The North Side held a magnet pull. Hustle, noise, opportunity, and a shadow economy that kept restaurants pouring after closing time. In those years before national prohibition, he drifted into the company of men who carried themselves like businessmen but kept pistols in their pockets. He learned that crews ran neighborhoods, that taverns paid for protection, that truckloads of beer could vanish and reappear with new owners, and that cash changed hands faster when fear worked alongside salesmanship. He had a gift for nerve and a stubborn streak that made him valuable. The nickname Bugs arrived in that period, pinned to him for his temper and unpredictable flares. He didn't choose it and didn't like it, but it stuck. In 1920, the Volstead Act turned liquor illegal, a decision that reshaped whole cities. A market worth millions went underground overnight, and the men who knew how to move freight, bribe officials, and silence rivals turned into bosses. Moran found a home with the North Side outfit led by Dean O'Banion, a florist by cover and a strategist by instinct. O'Banion kept a shop across from Holy Name Cathedral, where wedding orders, massed meetings, and bouquets traveled out the door while armored cars rolled elsewhere. Moran learned from him. Hire dependable drivers, keep books that make sense, pay off the right cops, and keep pressure on speakeasies so that money flows up and trouble flows down. He earned through bootlegging, emptying and refilling warehouses, and collecting from tavern owners who wanted beer on tap and no smashed windows. He also took part in robberies that targeted cash-rich targets, gambling rooms, payroll runs, and storage depots, crimes that brought fast money and the risk of long sentences. O'Banion's world banged against a rival empire on the South Side. Johnny Torrio and his protege, Al Capone, had their own pipelines, their own judges in their pocket, their own trucks rumbling with whiskey and beer. Conflicts started small, bottles smashed, drivers beaten, routes poached, and escalated into murders in alleys and halls. In November 1924, O'Banion was lured into his flower shop and shot dead by men tied to the other side. That killing rewrote the map of Chicago crime. Moran watched a mentor fall and moved within a crew suddenly hungry for revenge. O'Banion's successor, Jaime Weiss, organized counterattacks. Torrio was ambushed outside his home in early 1925 and survived, badly shaken, and soon set off for Italy. Capone stepped fully into leadership of the South Side machine. For Moran, these years were not only about carrying a gun, they were about building a business. The North Side ran fleets of trucks loaded with beer from hidden breweries, collected payments from dozens of illicit bars, and maintained lookout teams at key corners. He took a lead in enforcing territory lines north of the river. Tavern owners knew a visit could bring either a handshake or a warning. There were beatings and shootings in that climate, because that was how those borders were kept in that era. At the same time, Moran cultivated a public face that set him apart. He often voiced disdain for prostitution and claimed he wouldn't traffic in it. Whether from faith, image, or habit, he drew a line there, even while he ran liquor, led holdups, and enforced rackets. The feud with Capone became personal. Weiss staged one of the most famous attacks of the period, the assault on the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero in 1926, Capone's base of operations. Cars rolled up, doors opened, and machine guns poured fire into the building's facade. It was spectacle meant to rattle a rival and send a message: nowhere is safe. Though accounts differ about who stood where, it was a North Side mission, and Moran moved in those decisions. The attack injured bystanders and rattled Cicero, and it made it clear the war would not remain quiet. Retaliation followed. In October 1926, Weiss was killed near Holy Name Cathedral, steps away from the street where O'Banion had worked. The North Side lost another leader. Vincent "Schemer" Drucci took over, but died during a confrontation with police the following spring. With Weiss and then Drucci gone, Moran rose. He didn't inherit a calm estate. He stepped into a storm that pounded Chicago with front-page violence, funerals with heavy flowers, and court cases that went nowhere because witnesses kept their heads down. As leader, Moran tightened control over what remained of North Side territory. He continued activities that had fueled the organization: bootlegging, running trucks at night, hijacking rival shipments when information came through, and charging business owners for protection. He was arrested multiple times through these years on suspicion of robbery or vagrancy, or for carrying weapons, but Chicago's courts were slippery. Witnesses wavered, jurors had doubts, and lawyers were adept. He built a reputation for surviving close calls. He was not simply a fighter. He had a mind for logistics and morale. He tried to keep a degree of discipline, pushed back on some vices he considered out of bounds, and built alliances where they helped him resist Capone's pressure. One ally was Joe Aiello, a Sicilian grocer turned boss, who hated Capone at a level that consumed him. Aiello and Moran found common cause. They shared intelligence, traded resources, and leaned on each other to keep pressure on the South Side. In September 1928, Antonio Lombardo, a Capone ally, was assassinated. Rumors swirled that Aiello was behind it, with help or encouragement from North Side men. Official proof never matched whispers, and Chicago was full of whispers then. What mattered was that the city's violence surged again, and Moran's name hovered in background conversations as someone who refused to fold. Meanwhile, Capone grew richer and more visible. He courted reporters, handed out charity at Christmas, and posed in tailored suits. Moran mocked that image in private and in public. He viewed it as hypocrisy and worked to undercut it by striking at Capone's income streams. Hijacking became a consistent tactic. Find a shipment from a rival brewery, surround it with cars, seize the load, and sell it yourself. There were robberies outside Chicago too, when cash in transit looked vulnerable. None of this was unique to Moran, but he ran a crew that made it a priority. At the same time, he had glimpses of a life with normal trappings, apartments away from the heat, dinners in quiet rooms, briefly steady relationships, yet chaos kept finding him. Police pressure rose, reformers demanded action, clergy blasted the lawlessness, and city councils talked big while taking envelopes from both sides. Every raid felt performative. Breweries were smashed only to be rebuilt, warehouses seized then reopened. Moran learned how to lay low when needed, showing up in taverns only when it helped him send a signal. He also learned when to speak to the press. He gave statements framing himself as a businessman forced into harsh tactics by an unfair law. He could be convincing, even charming, but his income still depended on crimes that harmed rivals, coerced tavern owners, and flooded neighborhoods with illegal drink. By late 1928 and early 1929, tension hit a high. Capone's crew wanted an end to North Side resistance, and Moran's attempts to chip away at their shipments enraged them. Rumors say that a large hijack embarrassed Capone shortly before Valentine's Day. In those months, Moran also sought more muscle. He kept men around him who could be trusted under fire. The Gusenberg brothers, James Clark, and others who had earned their keep on rough nights. The North Side headquarters used a cramped building on North Clark Street as a meeting and storage spot. Cars came and went, people talked too loudly, and watchers in neighboring windows took notes. Everything felt watched in those days. The morning of the 14th of February 1929 dawned cold and bright. A meeting about a cheap whiskey deal was on the calendar. The idea, according to many accounts, was a large sale that would restock North Side bars at a discount and make up for recent losses. Moran was supposed to attend. He approached the building, saw police cars, and changed course. Inside, 7 men waited and then died. The city gasped, police lights strobed, reporters ran, and radios spoke of a massacre that shocked even those numb to crime news. The main target had not been among the dead. He stepped back onto the street and into a shadow much larger than he could control. That day crystallized how far Chicago had gone. Moran condemned Capone publicly, telling reporters that only his rival's organization would commit such a ruthless act. Investigators chased leads that pointed to Capone's circle, to men dressed as police, to out-of-town gunmen, to cars and uniforms borrowed from corrupt officers. No court ever pinned the crime to a set of convicted killers. It sat there, a headline that turned into a chapter title. For Moran, it cut into the heart of his organization. Trusted men were gone. Confidence among allies wavered. The flow of beer and cash slowed. He would live on, but his grip loosened. Even in that blow, he refused to walk away. He met with remaining associates, moved operations, and tried to show strength. He had lived through raids, courtrooms, crossfire, and betrayal. He believed he could live through this too, but the city had changed, and so had the ground under his feet. Prohibition still paid, but not like before. The police had new leadership. Federal agents started paying closer attention to books and taxes. Moran kept moving from safe house to safe house, planning his next step with a stubborn determination that had guided him since his first arrests back in St. Paul. He had built a life on speed, nerve, and leverage. Now he would need patience, caution, and a kind of humility he had rarely shown. Through these years, he carried the marks of his choices. He had ordered robberies that shook small businesses, sent crews to seize trucks and intimidate tavern owners, and overseen bootlegging operations that filled speakeasies with banned liquor. He had allied with men who ran their disputes with bullets, as often as with words. He insisted on certain limits, saying he wouldn't run brothels or traffic in the most exploitative rackets. But the rest of his portfolio sat squarely in crime. He was a strategist of a particular time and place, and that time and place was burning, loud, and unsustainable. The night after the killings on Clark Street, he sat with his remaining circle and listened through the walls to the city's low thunder. He knew his enemies felt stronger. He knew funerals were coming. He also knew he had narrowly avoided death, not because he deserved mercy, but because he had happened to arrive late. That luck would not last forever. He would need to reposition, rebuild, and find new ways to survive pressure from men who did not forgive or forget. The room grew quiet, and he stared at a glass of water he didn't drink. Outside, streetcars rattled past and the winter wind pressed against thin windows. He had walked a long way from a St. Paul schoolyard to this moment, and the next move would either steady him or send him into a deeper fall. He didn't sleep the night after the garage killings. The air carried sirens and the low talk of people afraid to be heard speaking plainly. He moved apartments, not because he loved the view from a different block, but because familiarity could be fatal. The men around him kept voices low and coats on, even indoors. He had built years of momentum on the north side, and in one morning it felt like the ground gave way. He was not a man to quit. He was stubborn in the way that keeps a fighter standing after the bell. But even stubborn men know when to count who is left, write down what remains, and accept that the next chapter will not look like the last. Funerals rolled through the city, one after another. Priests kept their homilies careful. Friends stared at the floor instead of the casket. Reporters filled notebooks while pretending to pray. He stood far back from the doors, hat low, and left before the last hymn. He had learned long ago that being seen at the wrong time created its own risk. He also knew that grief could turn into recklessness, if you let it. He spoke with the men who were still standing and focused on the plainest tasks: where to meet, who could be trusted to drive, which taverns would still pay, and how to answer questions from policemen who wanted a quick headline more than a real answer. He told the press what he wanted the city to hear, that only one rival had the reach and cold nerve to stage a slaughter like that. He named the name everyone already suspected. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't theater either. It was a statement out of anger and calculation. He meant to make it harder for anyone to believe his enemy was untouchable. If the public believed that an empire had soaked a garage floor to get at him, then the public also might accept tougher officers and deeper inquiries into that empire's books. He knew that pressure cut both ways, and he hoped for it to tilt south. Behind the scenes, he tried to rebuild. The North Side still had speakeasies to supply, breweries working behind false walls, and drivers who knew which alleys could hide a truck. The organization had been wounded, not erased. He shifted meeting spots, changed telephone numbers, and insisted on tighter habits. He had always favored planning, and now he sharpened it. He wanted no more careless chatter in front rooms, no more loud boasts at midnight, no more people outside the circle hearing plans not meant for them. He had survived by being careful, and the survivors around him took their lead. Retaliation hung in the air. It had always been part of the business. From the first smashed delivery wagon to heavy days in Cicero, when bullets tore into a hotel's brick. After the garage killings, there were attempts all over town to strike at suspected planners and their closest deputies. The man often named by rumor as a chief organizer of the attack, a flashy sportsman with a fast grin who loved to be seen with a golf club or a girl on his arm, drew more than one hail of gunfire in the months that followed. The most famous attempt left him shaken but alive, the woman at his side telling police she had nothing useful to add. Whether Moran ordered specific strikes or simply allowed loyalists to act on their rage is an argument that started then and never settled for good. What is clear is that the North Side did not go silent. Life in Chicago shifted under the weight of all that noise. The stock market crashed in the autumn of 1929, deflating optimism that had seemed endless. Bread lines lengthened, factories slowed, and the gloss on the city's appetite for nightlife dulled. Yet the underground trade still moved. A pint that cost a nickel in 1926 might cost a bit more now. But the habit of meeting in back rooms and drinking against the law did not vanish. He kept trucks running, kept money flowing enough to pay drivers, guards, and the men whose jobs included knocking on doors and reminding tavern owners why certain deliveries ought to keep coming through the back. He still set limits in his own way. He had no use for brothels, and would not step into that line even when others said it was easy money. He told people that some sins carried such wreckage that he wanted no part in them. That didn't make him honest, but it did mark him as a boss with edges he would not cross. Federal attention grew. Men in plain suits arrived who didn't care about city politics or which ward leader owed who a favor. They tracked ledgers, tailed trucks, and tried to make cases that wouldn't unravel when a witness lost nerve. A young agent with clean habits and a straight back built a team that chose targets carefully, focusing on the financial guts of the South Side Empire. The effect spilled outward. Warehouses got raided with more persistence, and judges felt the wind change in their courtrooms. He could still find policemen who preferred a quiet envelope to a noisy raid, but it didn't work as smoothly as in the past. He told his people to expect more scrutiny and to travel lighter. He also knew that alliances mattered more than ever. He kept up a fragile network with men who wanted the same thing he wanted. A city where the South Side machine did not call every shot. The grocer turned boss, who had long despised the man in the tailored suits, remained a point of connection. They traded information, shared a lookout here and there, and tried to keep pressure on the same target. It was a friendship built less on trust than on parallel grievance. When that grocer fell in a storm of bullets one afternoon in 1930, cut down after refusing to hide, Moran lost a partner as stubborn as himself. Another lesson settled in: defiance without insulation was a lonely road. Even as allies fell and rivals flaunted their wealth, he looked for openings. He continued to hijack loads where intelligence was good. A driver paid $20 to move contraband might talk for 60. A shipment that left a covert plant could be intercepted after 2 turns, the cargo taken and resold under a different name. These were not noble acts. They were thefts from thieves, and still thefts. He justified them as tactics in a war that had been forced upon him by a murder in a flower shop years earlier, and then by the massacre meant for him. He woke each day, thinking that stepping back meant disappearing altogether. The press kept him in the public eye. His nickname never softened for him. He still considered it an insult. But he understood that notoriety could be useful in doses. He gave quotes that painted him as a businessman boxed in by a bad law, a man who might have run a legitimate empire if only lawmakers hadn't decided that ordinary drinkers needed to be policed at the bar. It was a half-truth at best. Before Prohibition, He had already practiced theft and violence. Yet many in the city preferred a story where gang leaders had been made by a clumsy statute. He let them believe it when it helped him. On the South Side, the man he condemned most loudly basked in a strange kind of celebrity. He handed out turkeys at holidays, tipped waiters heavily, and sat in box seats at ball games while police looked the other way. That spectacle provoked Moran. He mocked it in private with a mixture of scorn and disbelief. He could not understand why a city that buried decent men would applaud a showman who turned cruelty into a brand. He also knew that the showman's time might be shorter than it looked, because federal agents did arithmetic better than they did shootouts. When the tax case finally landed in 1931 and the showman was sent away, Moran watched a chapter close that he had tried to close with bullets. Justice had arrived wearing an accountant's visor. The change at the top of the South Side did not mean the world became gentle. A quieter man stepped forward to run day-to-day affairs, preferring meetings to headlines. The outfit, as people began calling it, learned to act like a corporation, spreading into unions, trucking, and businesses that wore clean collars while carrying dirty ledgers. Moran had neither the appetite nor the network to mirror that transformation. His strength had been territory, muscle, and quick operations. He tried to adapt by keeping his bootlegging and protection rackets steady, and he looked for places where he could still move with speed, but the industry was shifting out from under him. He was arrested more than once in those years for things that read small on paper and weighed heavily in real life. Vagrancy when a detective wanted to make a point, carrying a weapon in a city where a man in his line of work did not walk unarmed, suspicion of robbery when a payroll went missing, and every known tough in a 10-block radius was rounded up. He posted bond, walked out, and went back to the work he knew. That cycle wore down even a stubborn heart. He was not young anymore, the miles showed. One of the odd constants in his life remained his faith. He could drink hard on a Saturday and be found at the back of a church on a Sunday, hat in hand, listening while a priest spoke about duty and sin and the importance of making peace with both God and neighbor. People who knew him well said that he confessed with the same intensity he brought to a boardroom in a speakeasy. It did not change his business or soften his role in a scene that brought pain to many, but it colored his self-understanding. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw a man doing what he thought he had to do to hold his ground in a broken market. A man who drew lines where he could and ignored others when power demanded it. The Great Depression pressed down on every corner of the city. Bar owners struggled to pay, and some who had once handed envelopes over without complaint now stalled. He responded with a mix of patience and pressure. He cut deals for lower weekly payments with a few owners who had proven loyal. With others, he sent a reminder in the form of a broken sign or a smashed truck mirror. Damage that said a past arrangement still mattered. He hated waste and didn't enjoy destruction for its own sake. Making a point quickly and then restoring business was his preference. That approach did not reduce the fear his organization provoked. It simply aimed to keep the machine running. Meanwhile, the temper he'd carried since his youth still flared. He had worked to master it, because a leader who shouts all day drives even loyal people away. But every so often a careless subordinate, a loud talker, or a thief within the ranks would feel the edge of that temper in a closed room. He did not beat men to make a scene. He cut them loose, sometimes ruthlessly, and let word travel that his patience had limits. That was how order was kept in a trade where courts did not arbitrate disputes. It was not noble. It was the way it was then. Stories about new types of revenue reached him, labor rackets, control of markets that had nothing to do with bottles, even ventures beyond Chicago. He explored some, backed away from others. The outfit's shift into expansive white-collar rackets held no appeal. He trusted his instincts in hauling, storage, and night work, and in the occasional robbery that required planning and steady hands. Those robberies had been a part of his life since his teens. Payrolls looked tempting when cash-starved owners carried envelopes rather than using banks. He found himself again and again on the edge of that old talent, a line he knew better than most, a line that would shape his later years when the speakeasies went dry. By the early 1932, a feeling grew that the dry laws days were numbered. Juries grew impatient with cases that criminalized ordinary social behavior. Politicians began to speak openly about repeal, arguing that tax revenue from a legal industry could ease national hardship. For Moran, that talk sounded like the end of his longest-running income stream. He didn't romanticize it. He had made money from the ban and lost friends to it. He watched legislators whisper about new rules and felt a different kind of fear than the one that came when a tail car appeared in the rearview mirror. He worried about irrelevance. He tried more interstate work, edging into towns beyond Chicago where supply lines were less guarded. He planned jobs away from familiar streets, hoping to trade reputation for anonymity and cash. He used old St. Paul contacts who had known him as Adelard before the city christened him with an insult. Some of those jobs went off quietly. Others fell apart, small disasters that taught him how much luck had once covered weaknesses he didn't see. He was aging into a new country that valued accountants and undercover agents more than the men who once wore fedoras and tipped bellmen to keep doors open. Chicago, too, was learning. After the tax conviction that sent the South Side Star away, the remaining bosses learned to keep front pages clean. Killings didn't stop. They just got quieter. Unions held meetings where decisions were made about prices and routes, and those decisions sent money upward through channels designed to look legitimate. Moran's North Side never rebuilt to its old shape. He maintained a presence, kept some income flowing, and remained a name spoken with caution. But he could feel the center of the city's underworld moving to a table where he did not sit. He didn't stop. He told himself that he had lived through worse. He had. A flower shop and a cathedral had taught him how quickly a leader could fall. A garage had taught him how thin the line was between routine and catastrophe. Now, day by day, he adjusted, shifting to jobs that leaned on his earliest skills. He kept his suits pressed, kept his shoes shined, and walked into rooms with the authority of a man who had fought the toughest rival in America to a draw for years. He understood that dignity mattered, even when money thinned. When repeal finally arrived, when the law that had fed and bloodied a generation slipped away, he stood at a window and tried to imagine the future. Bars would reopen with licenses on their walls and daylight deliveries. Bottles would clink openly on tables without lookouts at the door. The city would earn taxes on every glass. He knew that a part of his life had ended not with a showdown but with a signature on a bill. He looked down at his hands and realized they were steady. The next phase would not be driven by kegs and roots. It would be leaner, harsher, and more dependent on the old craft that had first led him out of a St. Paul schoolyard and into courtrooms. He had made himself into George Moran from a boy named Adelard by using nerve, loyalty, caution, and a willingness to step over lines that most men never approach. Those qualities had kept him alive through some of the most infamous days in Chicago's history. Now those same traits would pull him onto roads beyond the city, into robberies and schemes that felt more personal and less organized than the years of breweries and speakeasies. He breathed in, squared his shoulders, and prepared to meet a country that was tired of hearing about bootleggers but would never run out of banks and couriers carrying cash from one quiet room to another. The end of the dry era did not bring him peace. It emptied a ledger. The trucks that once rolled all night with barrels and brown bottles no longer needed hidden garages, armed escorts, or lookouts with coded knocks. Legal distributors took over broad boulevards in daylight. The outfit moved smoothly into unions, trucking, and businesses with paper trails that could pass inspection. Moran had built his name on contested corners, hijacks, and a string of tavern accounts that only existed because of a ban. With that ban gone, he was left with a diminished crew, a stack of old grudges, and skills that did not translate to boardrooms. He did not complain to reporters about it. He put on his coat and looked for cash in places that remained poorly guarded. Bank jobs and payroll snatches were dangerous, profitable, and always present somewhere along Midwestern roads. A small-town bank would open its doors at 9. Farmers would walk in with deposits, and a teller would count white envelopes slowly while the manager watched the clock. That kind of place attracted men who knew how to move without freezing in the doorway. Moran slipped into that circuit with the hard experience of a man who had organized deliveries, escape routes, and split-ups for years. He did not invent a new craft. He returned to the one he had practiced before the breweries, back when he learned to case a target, choose a driver, and keep a timetable tight enough to beat a siren. He also tightened his circle. The North Side banner no longer rallied dozens. What he had instead were a handful of reliable faces who were willing to cross state lines, keep their mouths shut at roadside diners, and leave town before locals pieced together what had happened. They used cars that drew little attention. The guns they carried were for intimidation rather than spectacle. A job that took 3 minutes and sent no one to a hospital was a good job in his ledger. That approach kept violence from turning wild, not because he had grown gentle, but because quiet kept sentences shorter and headlines smaller. Chicago itself had shifted around him. The men who had learned from the showman sent away on a tax case reorganized the South Side operation into something less theatrical and more durable. They sat on union committees, shaped routes, fixed prices, and used accountants with steady hands. Even the occasional murder took on a lower profile. Moran watched that consolidation with a mixture of frustration and cold realism. The old gang war was over. The city no longer tolerated bravado. If he wanted to keep earning, he would have to do it mostly away from the river that had once marked the line of battle. He still kept a few city ventures alive. There were bar owners who owed him for past favors and feared what might happen if they forgot. He collected where he could, without making a scene. He never changed his stance on brothels, turning down invitations to dip into that trade when others said it would be easy money. That refusal did not wash him clean, but it was genuine. He drew a boundary and kept it, even when cash thinned. His money still came from crimes. Stick-ups, cut-ins on gambling rooms, hijacks when a quiet warehouse held a shipment that could be flipped quickly, and the occasional strong warning when a debtor pretended not to remember an arrangement. Police kept files on his movements, even when he left Chicago. Detectives in Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis swapped notes about a compact crew with polished shoes and an older leader who wore his hat low. Every now and then he would be picked up on a vagrancy count or a weapons charge, held overnight, and released when no one could tie him to a specific job. It was the story of his life. Plenty of suspicion, not a lot that stuck. That changed only when a case involved federal jurisdiction, a witness who didn't scare easily, or a mistake that left a trail too clear to ignore. Rumors swirled around revenge after the massacre years earlier. When a one-time Southside triggerman was gunned down in 1936, more than one headline wondered aloud whether Northside survivors had finally squared a ledger. No prosecutor proved a link to Moran, and nothing solid tied him to that hit. It is part of the historical record that his name kept appearing in speculation about score settling. He denied ordering revenge killings, telling interviewers that his focus had shifted to making a living rather than evening old accounts. People believed what suited their prejudices. He let the noise pass and concentrated on the next job. He traveled under his own name and under aliases that sounded ordinary in hotel registers. Cash paid for rooms. Meetings took place in diners with coffee that tasted like burnt bread, near bus stations where a person could disappear in 15 minutes. He preferred plans that used few people and moved fast. A car idled a block away with a driver he trusted. A second driver sat 3 blocks farther to complicate any chase. The inside work took less time than it took a bank to lock a vault. No dramatics, no speeches, no shooting if nerves held. That was the target he set for the kind of robberies he relied on after repeal. He was not always careful enough. In the late 1930 seconds, a case tied to a Midwestern robbery put him in front of a judge for more than a night. Testimony did not describe gore or heroics. It listed times, places, and withdrawals. Jurors listened to bank staff and highway patrolmen, then to defense counsel who said the state had a habit of blaming old names for new crimes. He did time, a block of years that marked the first clear shift from the swagger of a Chicago boss to the routine of an inmate. He had never been a stranger to cells. Reformatories and local jails had held him before. A longer sentence in a state facility told him the country had changed, and the old ease of "no one will talk" had thinned. Parole came, along with a vow to be smarter. He kept his head down for a while, using contacts to find small scores that drew minimal attention. Money disputes with federal agents did not interest him. He had watched Capone go down on an accountant's case and learned that you could beat a gunman and still lose to arithmetic. Cash in small piles moved hand to hand without ledgers. Even so, another job in the mid-1940 seconds pulled him into a bank case that crossed state lines and triggered federal involvement. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. The sentence ran into years. He entered federal custody older, leaner, and carrying the weight of a reputation that did not impress turnkeys. Prison stripped his world to essentials. No cars, no lookouts, no dinners in back rooms. He lived by a clock he didn't set. Work details filled days. He was not the only Chicago figure inside. Great names from the papers moved in the same corridors. Their suits traded for denim, their pride flattened by routine. He kept to his habits as far as rules allowed. Read newspapers, kept notes in a small pocketbook, stayed civil to staff, and distant from anyone who wanted to trade war stories. Inside, bragging created enemies. Silence kept you safer. When he returned to the outside, he found a world where the outfit had threaded itself through industries with a quiet competence, and law enforcement had grown more coordinated. Career criminals faced a choice between going small and low, or trying to fight corporations with a few men in a car. He was not built to run phony companies or skim union benefits. He chose the smaller path because it was the one he understood. He accepted that the age of big city gang chiefs had ended for him. What remained were careful, quick robberies, and the occasional dip into a gambling room's cash box, always trying to keep heat low. In Chicago and beyond, newspapers still used the nickname that he never liked. Headlines would call him by that tag even when the story was about a minor arrest. It sold papers to connect any holdup with the ghost of a garage long ago. He had to live with that narrative shaping what juries and judges thought before he said a word. He adjusted by refusing interviews and traveling farther from old neighborhoods. Street, Paul, where he had started as a restless kid skipping school, showed up again on his map as a place to pass through quietly, a reminder that the life he built had turned into a long loop across the same Midwestern counties. The list of offenses tied to his career by then was plain enough: burglary in his teens, armed robberies in his 20s and 30s, bootlegging and hijacking through Prohibition, conspiracy counts, weapons charge, repeated arrests for vagrancy used as pressure by police, extortion in the form of protection during his North Side days, and 2 significant bank robbery convictions after repeal. He consistently rejected the sex trade and shied away from narcotics. He engaged in shootings as part of territory wars earlier in life, and he denied ordering murders later, even while enemies of his circle died in confrontations that no one volunteered to solve. Wherever the law could document his involvement, he carried the sentence. Where only whispers existed, the whispers stayed whispers. He kept some of his old forms of devotion. A Catholic from youth, he continued to duck into churches when schedules allowed, lingering in the back rows. Priests who had watched him as a boy would not have been surprised to see him cross himself and slip out before the final hymn. Faith did not undo what he did for a living. It offered a frame for regret on days when regret found him. If that seems contradictory, it is because his life was contradictory. A man who drew a line at some trades while pushing hard into others that brought fear and loss to plenty of people. In the middle years of the 1,940 seconds, age and strain showed. The former boss still held himself with a certain old-world neatness: pressed tie, polished shoes, but cash did not stretch far. The outfit, richer than ever, iced out rivals without bluster. New names rose who had no memory of O'Banion, Weiss, or a flower shop near a cathedral. The city remembered Moran, mostly as a survivor of the massacre. Younger policemen knew the story from their elders and treated him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. That curious respect didn't soften their grip when the cuffs went on after a holdup went wrong. Trouble returned after a parole, when a fresh federal robbery case tied him to another crew and a bank job that didn't stay quiet. He was arrested again, prosecuted, and given a sentence that sent him to a federal penitentiary far from the streets where he had once controlled trucks and routes. He arrived carrying fewer illusions than before. Health had started to fail. Years in unheated apartments, cigarettes rolled between tense fingers, and the kind of stress that never really leaves a body had their say. Guards escorted him down halls where he would spend the last stretch of his story. In those final years, reporters wrote about him as a relic of the Prohibition age, a man left behind by an underworld that had traded street wars for ledgers and lawyers. He did not argue. Letters came from people who had turned gangland lore into a kind of folklore. He ignored most of them. A few he answered politely, in short sentences that did not glamorize anything. He had learned late that what looks like daring in headlines feels like anxiety in real time, and that anxiety hollows people out. Looking back across the span from a St. Paul schoolyard to federal custody, the line of his choices came into focus. He started as a truant and thief, climbed fast during a national experiment that outlawed what many still wanted to drink, squared off against a rival who loved attention, and got it, survived a morning that killed 7 men, and spent the rest of his life in smaller rooms and tighter budgets. He broke laws in ways that hurt people, even when he set limits on the types of businesses he would run. He used fear to take money. He designed robberies that left clerks shaken. None of that turned noble because he disliked certain vices more than others. He carried stubbornness like a badge from youth to old age. That trait kept him alive when others fell. It also kept him on a road that narrowed with each passing year, until the only exits led into courtrooms. The older man who stood before judges in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds no longer looked like the brash Northside captain from the Hawthorne drive-by days. He looked like a survivor who had run out of alleys. Yet even then he tried to negotiate one more chance, one more plan, one more seam in the system he had read so well in his prime. The country around him had changed. Banks installed better alarms, armored cars moved payrolls, small towns hired extra deputies, and federal agents communicated across state lines faster than before. The lone car with a driver and 2 men in the back seat could still succeed, but the window was closing. Moran, set in his methods, did not reinvent himself into a white-collar racketeer. He stuck to what he knew. That decision defined his last decade every bit as much as hijacking beer trucks had defined the years when Chicago roared. He did not pretend innocence. When questioned, he framed himself as a businessman made by a strange law, and then kept afloat by stubborn grit. That defense smoothed some edges but left the core intact. He had built a career on taking what was not his and enforcing it with the threat of force. Any night watchman or teller who went home shaking could have explained the cost better than he ever did. If his story carries value now, it rests in the clarity with which it shows how fast illicit success turns into decline, and how every shortcut collects its debt eventually, even from men who seem untouchable for a while. Chicago marched into the 1,930 seconds with a different gait, and he felt it in every doorway he passed. The loud parades of the dry years gave way to subtler arrangements behind office doors. Union halls mattered as much as alleys, and men who used to settle things with a carload of gunmen now preferred ledger sheets. He had lived through a decade when bravado seemed to pay. That season closed. What remained for him was a smaller, sharper world built around quick moves, small crews, and a habit of vanishing before anyone got a plate number. Old enemies either left by train under guards or learned to sit quietly behind fronts that looked clean. New bosses on the South Side avoided headlines and let accountants explain what muscle used to make plain. The change cut him out of the big game. North of the river, owners who had once depended on his trucks found wholesalers selling openly at noon. He wasn't the man who ran unions or bid on municipal contracts with a smile. He was a man who could still read a street and sense what time a teller unlocked a safe, and in the new era that meant staying on the road. He tried to hold a few of the old obligations together. A handful of taverns still sent envelopes his way out of habit and caution. The money looked thin compared to the Prohibition tide, but he had always been good at stretching lean weeks. He kept the same lines he had drawn in his mind since his rise. No houses of prostitution, no trade in heroin or cocaine, no schemes that preyed on the desperate. Those rules were real to him, rooted in the faith that had shaped him as a boy. They did not make him innocent. They marked the boundaries of a life still built around intimidation, hijacks, and the kind of robberies that put bank tellers to the floor and left them shaking after the door closed. Police files thickened in several cities, even when cases didn't stick. Detectives wrote memoranda about a tight group moving between Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio. They noted a compact leader with a clipped way of speaking and manners polished enough to pass for a salesman in hotel lobbies. Stops for vagrancy remained a tool for pressure. A gun under a coat meant a night in a cell and a judge in the morning. Questions never stopped. Answers stayed brief. No names, no sermons, no threats. He had learned early that the only line worse than a boast was a complaint. The city's papers wouldn't let his past go, even when he worked 2 states away. Every holdup anywhere near a highway became, for a day at least, a story about a survivor of a garage where 7 men died. It helped sell broadsheets to tie whatever had happened on a Tuesday to the murder of a florist years earlier. The attention did him no favors. He adjusted the way men trapped inside a story adjust. Short stays, cash for rooms, no fixed address anyone could give a deputy over a cup of coffee. Through those years, he kept meeting rooms small. A kitchen with a back door felt safer than a private dining room in a hotel. Plans lived on slips of paper for an hour, and then in the trash. Cars were rented in names that sounded like they belonged to bookkeepers. Get in, get out, and avoid panic, that was the rule. The crews he favored were the kind of men who didn't overtalk when nerves tightened. A job that ended with the clerk unharmed and the door closing behind them was a good job. He had seen enough of what happens when men chase spectacle. Spectacle draws patrol cars and prosecutors. Rumors about personal revenge trailed him. When a one-time Southside figure who loved golf and headlines was cut down on a February afternoon years after the garage killings, whispers leaped to the Northside survivor in the same breath. No prosecutor ever placed him at the scene or tied him to the gunman. The talk survived because the tragedy in the garage continued to haunt the city, and people preferred symmetry in their stories. He never addressed the speculation beyond a shrug that could be read as denial or weariness. The wars of the 20s had bred too many grudges to chase one by one. The mid-1000, 930 seconds hardened him. Cash came in bursts, dried up, and came again. There were weeks when he vanished into the countryside, using old St. Paul connections to find quiet rooms and less obvious marks. There were weeks when Chicago pulled him back for meetings about trivial turf that once wouldn't have merited an afternoon. Pride took blows. He kept his shoes shined and his voice steady because control begins with such things, even when rent is due and no one wants to owe you anymore. By the late 930 seconds, he stood far from the city's center of underworld gravity. Frank Nitti, then Paul Ricca, and Tony Accardo were teaching the outfit to make money while leaving fewer fingerprints. If violence came, it arrived quietly. Docks, laundries, delivery routes, labor contracts, money flowed through them with less noise. He was not shut out because of a single betrayal or a famous order. He was shut out by evolution. He could not turn himself into a corporate thief. He was still a street strategist, and the country had shifted toward suits who hid knives inside the minutes of a meeting. The law kept pace. Federal agents shared information across state lines. Bank alarms improved. Armored cars replaced payroll clerks with satchels. Even so, gaps remained: rural roads, small towns where a bank opened before the sheriff finished his coffee, couriers who trusted routine. He stepped into those gaps. That choice defines the next part of his story as clearly as anything in the 20s. Robbery again. This time without the excuse of a national ban creating a shadow industry. He had returned to the craft he learned as a teenager, wrapped now in middle age and the weariness that comes with it. One job in the mid-1000, 940 seconds, brought the first sentence that truly felt long. The case centered on a robbery in Ohio. A bank messenger pushed into a wall and relieved of his bag on a weekday morning. There were no theatrical pursuits, no headlines about a citywide lockdown. Investigators followed tire tracks, routine witnesses, and scheduling details, stacked small facts, until they formed a picture a jury could accept, and put him in that picture. He had beaten dozens of cases with silence and flaws in the state's story. This one held. The conviction sent him away for years, rather than months. Prison at that age was a stripping away. A man who once stood in tailored wool and called shots now listened to a guard rattle keys. Work details, lights out, and rules that didn't bend much formed the horizon. He stayed to a narrow lane, did what was required, avoided borrowed enemies, read whatever he could get, and waited. That waiting did not carry glamour. Friends from earlier days were gone, dead, or transformed into businessmen who wouldn't take his calls if he had been able to make any. He followed news of the outfit and the almost invisible way it was remaking the underworld. Giancana was a name he learned mostly on paper. The next generation was rising while he measured time by institutional clocks. He never gave self-pity space for long. A habit of blunt self-appraisal had kept him alive. He knew what had put him in that bed, and what he had done to others along the way. To teach himself those habits, he did not spend nights retelling stories where he was a victim of chance. Tired men in locked wards have to decide whether to burn themselves down with regret or carry it in a pocket that doesn't show. He chose the pocket. Parole arrived, and with it the familiar strangeness of walking back into a world that hadn't been waiting for him. Chicago had become nearly unrecognizable as a criminal market compared to the 20s. The outfit's hands were in trucking routes, wholesale produce, labor locals, bookmaking conducted at a scale that no one shouted about. Old North Side hangouts were gone, or softly policed by people who answered to men he had never sat with. He was a figure from the past, in a city that wanted a quieter present. He tried legitimate work in brief bursts, the way many men with records did when options were few. A warehouse needed labor. An acquaintance with a delivery business offered a week of shifts. A friend's relative put in a word at a garage. The money never came steady enough. Waiting for a boss to say yes was difficult for a man who had built his life on making his own timetable. Pride had something to do with it. Habit did too. It is not easy to learn at 50 what you didn't study at 20. The return to robbery was not a leap but a slide. The necessities of rent, food, and a bit of cash in the pocket pulled him back toward what he knew he could still do. Pick a soft target. Gather 2 men who didn't scare easily, and avoid flamboyance. He told himself he would keep it small, keep it safe for bystanders, keep it so quiet that he could slip away between jobs. There is a kind of logic there, but it folds under the pressure of modern policing. Networks that didn't exist when he was young now connected patrolmen in Ohio with agents in Chicago and clerks at federal offices. The margins closed. Lawyers still found arguments. The press still had an appetite for tying his name to any heist they couldn't solve in 48 hours. But jurors had grown less romantic. Movies had shown them enough of the old mythology to dull the thrill. A clerk with children and a mortgage looked nothing like an adversary to be outwitted. He looked like a victim. The climate in courtrooms had turned colder for men in his trade. He recognized that the public had adjusted to a new standard. The band that once turned a city into a carnival was gone. And with it, any tolerance for saying a tough law pushed a man to tough acts. Personal life thinned to essentials. A small suitcase, a set of clothes well cared for, a habit of keeping cash separate so that a night's loss didn't empty everything that was his world on the road. He had married in earlier years and tried domestic steadiness more than once, but the life he chose never let roots take. Friends who stayed loyal did so quietly, offering a bed for a night or a ride out of town rather than bold favors that would cost them everything. He accepted those kindnesses without drama, and he did not linger to make them expensive. Health did what years and worry make health do. He moved a little slower and hid that slowness. Cigarettes took their toll. Winters bit deeper. None of it changed the way he carried himself when he walked into a room. Dignity mattered to him for reasons that went beyond vanity. It was a way of asserting that even if a man has spent half his life breaking laws, he can still hold to a standard about how to speak and how not to panic. The record from those post-parole years shows a pattern that had followed him since he first found a crew in St. Paul. Surveillance, suspicion, a few clean getaways, then a case that stuck. He was arrested in the mid-1950s in connection with a robbery in Ohio that crossed jurisdictions and brought federal prosecutors into the picture. The evidence did not look like the wild stories people told about the garage or the Cicero drive-by long ago. It looked like times, distances, and witnesses who kept their composure. He faced the charges in a courtroom where his name did him no favors. Conviction returned him to a federal penitentiary. He entered thinner than before, older than most men in those blocks, with fewer illusions about time. Guards and inmates knew who he had been because the press had explained it for decades. Fame doesn't buy comfort inside, it buys curiosity. He answered little, worked where he was told to work, read prayers in a voice barely above a whisper, and kept a neat bunk. If he allowed himself any indulgence, it was memory faces from the North Side that ached to recall, moments when a small choice had set off a sequence he could still trace by street names. Outside, the city that had made him and nearly unmade him moved on. The cathedral across from a flower shop still rang its bells. The outfit passed influence from one careful set of hands to another. Writers began turning the dry years into lore, smoothing edges, turning anxious nights into adventures. He was written into those tales as an antagonist to the biggest figure of the age, a role that sold books and filled theaters. He understood the gap between story and life better than most. The story shined. The life bled cash, sleep, friends, and finally health. What is plain from the record by then is the list of crimes that defined his decades. Early burglaries and thefts in St. Paul, armed robberies as a young man in Chicago, bootlegging, hijacking, and extortion during Prohibition as part of the North Side Gang, participation in violent conflicts that enforced territory lines in the 20s, arrests for weapons, conspiracy, and vagrancy used by police as leverage in the 30s, robberies in the Midwest after repeal, including the Ohio case that drew a significant sentence in the 40s, violation of parole through fresh involvement in a federal robbery case in the 50s. He remained opposed to brothels and narcotics and kept to that refusal. The rest, the profits he extracted by threat, the fear his men created, the lives altered by the wars he fought are part of his ledger. Whether or not a judge wrote them in ink, from a cell late at night, he could hear a train on tracks that ran past the prison fence. The sound folded years together the freight cars that carried beer under canvas in the 20s, the night rides out of Chicago when a job went wrong, the trips back to St. Paul to breathe for a week before stepping into it again. He was a boy who ran from school to alleys, and a man who tried to hold a shrinking kingdom with stubbornness and nerve. That boy and that man met in the dark, while the train passed and settled the argument without words. He had chosen, and the bill had come due. By the time Snow returned to the yard, his breath came with a rasp that reminded him how long he'd been carrying strain. The walk to the chapel felt farther each week. He kept going anyway, hat in his hands, lips moving in a low voice that hardly rose above a whisper. Guards learned not to rush him. He still kept the small courtesies that had mattered to him since he was young. "Yes, sir, thank you, no need for trouble." He asked for newspapers whenever the cart rattled past, scanning the pages even when headlines had nothing to do with him. Music drifted from a radio behind a clerk's desk during count. It felt like a station from another country. A prison hospital has a rhythm that flattens every story. He watched it from a bed near a window that gave him a thin slice of sky. Orderlies pushed carts. Nurses spoke in gentle tones. A chaplain stopped by at odd hours. He did not turn those visits into theater. They talked quietly, not about legends, not about famous rivals, but about the weight of choices and the strange mix of pride and shame that lives inside men who have spent years convincing themselves they were doing what the times demanded. He listened more than he spoke. Listening had been his better habit in the years when talking got other men killed. News from Chicago reached him in pieces. He read about politicians arguing over budgets, a parade on a boulevard he used to avoid, a ball club that couldn't catch a break. Every so often, a writer reached back into the old stories to draw a line between the city's present and a morning in February that had never quite released its hold on the place. He saw his nickname in print and felt the old irritation. He had never chosen that tag. It clung to him the way some mistakes do, long after a man's life has moved on. He had time to consider the arc from the alleys of St. Paul to that room. The record that could be verified ran straight through petty theft in adolescence, early arrests that taught him how cold a cell feels at night, a move to Chicago where a quick mind and steel nerves got him noticed, and then the climb through a market created by a law that turned drinkers into customers for men with trucks. He helped hijack beer. He sent crews to collect weekly envelopes from bars. He made sure rival shipments went missing. He gave orders that put rivals in danger and sometimes worse. He carried a pistol when he stepped out the door because that was how meetings ended more often than anyone wanted to admit. He enforced territory through fear. He preferred no blood on the floor when a point needed to be made. But he had lived inside a war where bullets spoke too often. He knew what the law had on paper for later years, too. After repeal, he stepped back into robberies, targeting banks and payrolls that looked softer than they were. Some went fast, without anyone hurt beyond a bad scare. Others drew a line of facts that prosecutors could stack in front of jurors' rental slips, license numbers, witnesses who noticed details like the tilt of a hat or a way of walking. That evidence sent him to prison in the 1,940 seconds. He served years, came out with the intention to keep his head down, then got caught in another case tied to a bank messenger whose routine made him vulnerable. That case brought federal time. He landed in a penitentiary far from Clark Street, far from the corner by the cathedral, where a florist's front had covered so much of the business that made his 20s roar by. Doctors told him the truth the way professionals do when there's no kindness in pretending. He took it in silence, nodded, and thanked them for being clear. He asked for a priest and got one. They prayed without fuss. He didn't make grand statements. He had spoken loudly enough in earlier chapters of his life. A man doesn't need to shout at the end. Letters found him. A few came from strangers who had turned the old chaos into a kind of entertainment. He didn't answer those. He had better uses for breath and paper. Other notes arrived from people who knew him years earlier and wanted him to know that they still remembered his decency when a meeting ended, his habit of paying drivers on time, his refusal to traffic in bodies or powders even when money dangled. He read those, folded them carefully, and put them under the thin mattress with the other pieces of his past that meant something to him. While he watched the sky, his mind carried him backward to days that had hardened him. He could picture the inside of the Schofield flower shop, the hush of polished floors, the smell of cut stems, the coded conversations carried out near bouquets destined for weddings and funerals. He could remember Jaime Weiss's fire, and the way a plan would lay itself across a table in maps and schedules. He could remember how a young crew turned a hotel in Cicero into a target as a message to a rival who believed himself beyond harm. He could remember the sting in his chest the morning 7 men lay on a cold floor because he was late by minutes. He never forgot that part. He never let himself pretend there was any nobility in such mornings. He had called that act ruthless to any reporter who would scribble the quote, and he meant it. He had lived in that shadow ever since. Those images didn't erase the other side of his ledger, the smaller scenes that don't end up in films. A terrified bartender handing over cash for protection rather than risk week-long trouble. An owner staring at a cracked mirror that proved an agreement still stood. A driver climbing into a cab after a hijack with hands still shaking. A bank clerk going home to a family and pretending the day had been normal. He had caused that fear. He didn't dramatize it now. He recognized it as the cost of the choices he had made to keep his operation above water in a city where kindness rarely held a corner for long. The names from the war years passed through his mind, too. O'Banion with his odd mix of charm and chill. Weiss with a stubborn bravery that felt like a dare to the whole city. Drucci, quick to smile and quicker to slam a door. Joe Aiello, consumed by hate for the man on the south side who liked photographs and applause. The Gusenberg brothers who always showed up when the clock said to show up. James Clark, whose death in that garage hit him like a hammer. History wrote those men in boldface, then turned the page. He knew them as men who told jokes when a plan went right, who ran when a window shattered, who prayed when that felt like the only option left. He remained certain about the lines he wouldn't cross. He had been raised by French-speaking Catholics who drilled commandments into him with the same insistence they used for multiplication tables. He broke laws, plenty of them, but he wouldn't profit from prostitution, and he wanted no hand in pushing powders or needles. People used that line later to polish him. He shrugged at that when anyone pressed. He drew boundaries for his reasons, and he was responsible for everything else he did on the far side of those boundaries. He didn't need a medal for refusing one kind of wrong while committing another. Illness tightened its grip. He still tried to walk the corridor during free hours, though the distance shrank. A guard once offered him a chair halfway to the end of the hall. He sat, not happily but gratefully. Pride hadn't vanished. It had changed shape. Pride was now the choice to be courteous when discourtesy would be easy, to be calm when panic could be excused, to answer straight when small lies would make conversations shorter. A final set of papers, forms, signatures, stamped lines moved across desks while he dozed. They listed what the institution needed to list when a man had more days behind him than ahead. His name in full, the one a priest spoke over a tiny font of water in St. Paul before anyone called him anything else, went on those papers. He liked that. Before the newspapers had made him a character, he had been a child with a family name that talked about ancestry and hope. He was not a sentimentalist, but he permitted himself that small thought. On a day at Winter's Edge in 1957, a chaplain's prayer settled over his bed. He heard it dimly, like a song from outside the yard. He reached for the sign of the cross the way he'd done in back pews across 4 decades, from Minnesota to Chicago to rooms where no one checked how a man held his hands. He went still, not long after. No drama attended that moment. He had never thrived on drama, not really. He had operated in a world addicted to spectacle, but his own preference had always been quiet efficiency. Not much money remained. He had spent fortunes on legal fees, payoffs, travel, and the endless costs of running organizations that never appear on balance sheets. What cash he had at the end barely covered modest arrangements. Relatives handled the basics, working with kindness rather than extravagance. Papers ran obituaries that summed him up in a few paragraphs. St. Paul youth turned Chicago boss. Prohibition antagonist. To a South Side giant, a survivor of a massacre, a man imprisoned late for robberies that did not match the scale of his earlier years. Some pieces stretched truth or confused names. He did not have to read them to know. Newspapers had been making casual errors about him since his 20s. In the weeks after, Chicago carried on in its careful way. The outfit remained what it had become, a business that hid power inside contracts and regulated markets. Younger thieves kept their eyes on armored cars and credit offices rather than beer barrels. Bars poured legally while licensed trucks delivered exactly what the license said they delivered. The street where the old garage stood was lined with storefronts that owed nothing to a past they barely recalled. Memory faded for everyone except those who had lived through the noise. What endures in the factual record once you sieve out myth is the outline of a life built on velocity, nerve, and a willingness to scare people in order to collect money. He climbed quickly when the law made his kind of craft valuable. He fought a rival who built an empire on image and intimidation. He helped orchestrate hijacks and sit-downs and retaliations that kept his side alive longer than many expected. He took over as leader after others fell. He avoided brothels and narcotics, but held fast to bootlegging, extortion, and robbery. He survived the morning that would define his name for a century. He faded into smaller crimes when his era closed. He went to prison more than once. He died in custody. People sometimes ask, even decades later, what he had that made him rise as quickly as he did. The answer is not mystery. He had steadiness during chaos, a capacity for calculation under pressure, a refusal to chatter, and a code, however narrow, that made him predictable to those who worked with him. In another setting, those traits might have built a warehouse business or a delivery firm. In the setting he chose, they built a criminal career that fed many and frightened more. He took responsibility for it in the way men like him take responsibility, not with speeches, but with a hard look at a mirror in the morning and the resolve to step into the day he had made. His crimes do not need embellishment to be understood. The lists are plain: early burglaries in Minnesota, arrests for theft and related offenses as a young man, participation in armed robberies in Chicago, organization of bootlegging operations during the dry years, extortion of bar owners through the threat of smashed stock, or worse, hijacking of rival liquor shipments, involvement in a cycle of violence during the North Side-South Side feud, including attacks meant to rattle a rival's headquarters, repeated arrests for weapons and conspiracy counts, interstate robberies after repeal, significant convictions in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, tied to bank and payroll thefts that resulted in long sentences. Death behind walls. Those are the verifiable markers. Stories that assign additional murders to him after the massacre remain largely unproven, loud, persistent, and as often wrong as right. What remains after the paper trail is a caution fit for any age that tempts men with shortcut routes to power. The city he moved through rewarded speed for a while. It also built courtrooms and prisons for the end of that road. He knew that balance better than most by the time he closed his eyes. He had tried to run faster than consequences. For years he did. Then the arithmetic of diligence, patrolmen talking to agents, clerks comparing numbers, witnesses memorizing small details caught up. Somewhere in St. Paul, bells still ring in churches like the ones that set the pace of his childhood. Somewhere in Chicago, the cathedral's doors still open and close, while people hurry past the corner where a flower shop once stood. Those soundings belong to a city's ordinary life, not to the nocturnal circuits he ran. He would have liked that. The return to ordinary. The story people tell about him can stay loud or go quiet. It won't change what he did or what he learned. He learned that fear does not hold a city forever. He learned that a man's habits shape his end. He learned that dignity has nothing to do with winning, and everything to do with how a person carries a truth once it is unavoidable. Long after he was gone, the record stayed behind in file boxes. Ink on old paper that doesn't forget. Clerks stacked reports, mug shots, booking sheets, notes from detectives who trailed him across winter streets. Those pages carried the rhythm of his life more faithfully than any story told at a bar. They showed a start in St. Paul, charges for theft and burglary in his teens, a move south to a city that turned stubborn boys into men who thought speed could outpace consequence, and the decades of choices that followed. Reading that paper trail is like walking a route he knew well. Alleys, side doors, Late-night rooms, the flash of a badge, the door of a cell. It is not a glamorous route. It is a tour of a man who learned early to live by nerve and then tried for too long to live on nothing else. The first pages catch him as a runaway with a gift for picking locks and slipping past attention. Reformatories tried to temper him. Stints inside gave him practice in keeping his mouth closed, and that habit would serve him later. When Chicago drew him in, he had already learned that a small crew can change a neighborhood's heartbeat by standing still on a corner and letting people notice who is watching. He fell in with men who wore ties as if they were proof of respectability, even while their days revolved around trucks that never saw the sun if it could be avoided. He learned how to turn a storefront into a front, how to read a policeman's posture, how to measure a tavern owner's nerve by the way he held a glass. Those skills, ordinary on their own, add up when combined in one person. They made him useful to Dean O'Banion, and then to the North Side crew that tried to keep a bigger machine from rolling over them. He rose not because he was wild, but because he could think and keep time. He knew when to thrift words, when to accept a compromise, and when to drive hard. He ran beer with an organizer's mind. Hidden breweries needed grain, guards, quiet bookkeepers. Trucks needed routes that did not cross a patrol car at the wrong moment. Bartenders needed to trust that smashing a window would be the hardest message they'd see if they paid what they owed. He kept those moving parts in order. He also planned hijacks against rivals with calm precision, turning a corner into a bottleneck and a shipment into cash in a matter of minutes. That work was theft, straight and simple, even when framed as business in a strange market. He understood that, and he did it anyway, because power in that city during those years flowed toward whoever could control supply and punish disobedience without stirring up so much noise that reformers shut the whole street down. When O'Banion fell in his flower shop, a chill passed through the North Side. Jaime Weiss answered with a force that set new rules for how loudly the fight would be carried on. A carload of men raked the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero in 1926, bullets tearing brick and glass to send a message to the South Side's leader that nowhere was safe. Moran stood close to those decisions, one of the men who didn't scare easily and could keep a plan straight when adrenaline tried to bend it. The retaliation that came for Weiss outside Holy Name Cathedral shook the outfit again. Drucci's death in police custody in 1927 shook it again. Each loss moved Moran closer to the chair at the center of the table. He never forgot the look of a city that had decided headlines would be written in steel. He wore that look long after the papers stopped shouting. The morning at 2000, 122 North Clark Street in 1929, imprinted him on the public mind. 7 lay inside a garage that fronted as a cartage company. He was late and lived. Police chased uniforms, cars, rumors, and out-of-town names. Investigators leaned on forensics in a way that hinted at a future, testing bullets, comparing marks, trying to let science speak where witnesses would not. No court ever settled the case. Most people decided they knew who had ordered it. He said what the city already believed and used the moment to press for pressure on his enemies' accounts. The practical result for him was a broken crew, fewer trusted hands, and a stream of money that slowed the way a river slacks when an upstream gate closes. He tried to rebuild, as he had done after other funerals. The city had changed underneath him, and this time rebuilding meant holding ground rather than charging forward. He brought a kind of discipline to his crew that wasn't common in that time. He paid on schedule. He expected drivers to keep quiet and show up where they said they would be. He didn't tolerate freelancing that created noise for the sake of bravado. He didn't run brothels, and he wouldn't touch narcotics. He saw those trades as a line he wouldn't cross, an old rule hung on the wall of his mind by the nuns and priests who drilled him as a boy. That rule didn't make him gentle. It narrowed his focus. He stuck to bootlegging, hijacking, extortion in the form of protection, and the robberies that had marked his earliest years. He enforced with threats and, in bad hours, with gunfire, because that is what enforcement looked like in that business. But even in the worst weeks, he favored speed and surprise over street fireworks, because attention ruins margins. After repeal, the ledger on his desk looked thin. Trucks ran openly under licenses. Warehouses paid taxes and stacked bottles where sunlight could touch them. The outfit reorganized and placed steady hands at union tables and company boards. Moran kept moving because moving was what he knew how to do. He slid back into the world of bank lobbies, payroll satchels, and the rules of 3-minute jobs. Those rules are plain. Never linger. Never talk more than you must. Never draw the eye unless you have to. Never assume a witness didn't notice something, even if he looked down at his shoes. He followed those rules and still met the truth that persisted before and after his name mattered. Patience and paperwork can catch men who pride themselves on swiftness. One Ohio job in the mid-1940 seconds became the first long sentence that pulled him out of circulation for years rather than months. Federal attention is patient. Agents collect tire casts, rental slips, incremental bits of testimony. They don't need a scene to prove a case. They need links. Those links landed him in a cell where the clock ruled every step. He served, came out with a plan to be smaller and smarter, and slid again when cash ran short. Another case put him in federal custody a second time. He did not roar against fate. He walked to the bus in cuffs and took stock of a life that had traded the roar of the 20s for the scrape of chairs in a prison mess hall. His last months were a long fade in a hospital ward, where kindness came in small acts, a blanket pulled up by a nurse, a second cup of coffee poured by an orderly, a chaplain who did not try to make poetry out of a hard life. He died there. Lung cancer ended it. He left little money and a name stamped on headlines that had been growing smaller with each telling. Obituaries made neat arcs of a life that had never been neat. They said St. Paul youth, Chicago boss, Prohibition adversary to a man who courted cameras, survivor of a garage, late robber, inmate. All true, none complete. The complete story lived in the mix of fear, calculation, stubbornness, and routine that sustained him for decades. People who try to separate legend from fact in his case come back to a few steady points. He was born Adelard Leo Cunnin, a son of French-speaking parents who held to Catholic forms and hoped their boy would live within ordinary bounds. He picked locks and pockets early, found the North Side outfit through O'Banion, learned to run beer like a business, enforced with coercion and, when pushed, with bullets. He accused his rival of ordering the worst day of the bootleg wars, and meant it. He led what remained of the North Side gang after Weiss and Drucci died. He built alliances with other enemies of the South Side machine, especially Joe Aiello, who could not let go of his own vendetta and paid for it. He rode out the end of Prohibition, failed to become a corporate racketeer, turned back to robberies, took long sentences, and died in federal custody in the 1950 seconds. He drew a line at prostitution and narcotics and stuck to it. He is tied by rumor to revenge killings. Prosecutors never closed those loops with proof. That is the spine of the story. Around it stretch the smaller segments that made the days heavy. Meetings in rooms above bowling alleys, coded phone calls, cars idling 2 blocks away, a look exchange that told a driver to wait 30 seconds longer, an envelope handed off without eye contact, a bartender's sigh after a collector left. The way a city's map redraws itself when rival trucks change, which streets they avoid. He lived inside those details. His men lived there with him. So did every person who had to figure out whether to push back, pay, or move. For them, this was not a movie. It was a Tuesday. Some parts of the record still inspire arguments. Did he personally order every hijack credited to the North Side after O'Banion's murder? Almost certainly not. Crews had autonomy, and leaders signed off on patterns rather than single acts. Did he stand behind every assault aimed towards Cicero? He had a voice in those decisions. He wasn't the only voice. Did he plan retaliation against the sportsmen who drew headlines after the massacre? The public loved that symmetry. Files never nailed it down. Did he truly refuse to profit from brothels at cost to his finances? Men who worked for him said yes. So did rivals who mocked him for it. That consensus is unusually strong for a rumor-rich era. The sum of his crimes reads clean on a single page. Burglary as a teenager. Theft. Repeated arrests for robbery before Prohibition. Participation in armed robberies during his early Chicago years. Orchestration of bootlegging routes after the Volstead Act. Extortion of saloon owners. Hijacking rival shipments. Carrying weapons without permits. Conspiracy counts tied to those operations. Violent enforcement during the North Side, South Side feud. Attempted murders and assaults attributed to his circle during that period. Interstate robberies after repeal, including cases in the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds. that brought him long sentences. Violation of parole through fresh involvement in a bank messenger job, death in prison. There is no need to gild that list. It stands on its own and shows a life spent pushing against the law in ways that frightened bystanders and emboldened his own circle until the arithmetic of accountability caught up. He stayed a churchgoer, often in back pews, through all of it. That detail unsettles people who want clean categories. He could sit respectfully through a sermon and then walk out to plan a day that included taking money from someone who would be worrying about the next knock on the door. Human beings hold contradictions without exploding. He held his, acknowledged them in private, justified some of them as the price of a city's broken rules, and stopped short of justifying others. Confession gave him words for sorrow. Habit overruled that sorrow too often. That is not an inspiring admission. It is a true one. Witnesses to his temper used the nickname that followed him. In Chicago's slang, Bugs marked a man as unpredictable. He disliked it. He prided himself on control. The tag stuck anyway because it made headlines faster. Reporters preferred a man with a brand. He gave them quotes when it served him and stayed away when it didn't. He understood press as leverage. He never mistook it for loyalty. Law enforcement used his name as a focusing tool through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Tie a robbery to Moran, and you got attention. Tie a hijack to his crew and doors opened in other departments. That worked both ways. At times he was blamed for acts he hadn't touched. At other times the extra heat distracted attention from somebody else whose work he understood too well to name. In a strange way, notoriety bought cover for people who learned to move beneath it. He saw that pattern and sighed the way an old man sighs when he watches a trick he used to perform. His rivals from the South Side played a longer game. After their showman went to prison on a tax case, they learned to avoid murals painted in bullets. They kept power by distributing risk and dressing profit in contracts. That shift hurt every operator who relied on menace rather than management. Moran's attempt to pivot never completed. He could read a street as well as anyone alive. He never learned to love a balance sheet with shell columns. The outfit, under quieter bosses, drained the city of cash through businesses that could withstand daylight. He was a man of night schedules and sudden pressure. He understood why he was losing the kind of influence that had once come easily to him. He couldn't become the kind of leader who stayed influential without drawing fire. What people remember about him depends on where you place your ear. Old parishioners remembered a man who nodded at ushers and left without shaking hands. Former drivers remembered a boss who paid at the end of a shift and didn't move the goalposts. Rivals remembered someone who hated showmanship and still found himself stuck in the biggest show of the decade because fate and a clock aligned. Policemen remembered a subject who could sit in a chair for hours without giving them a word to twist. Bank clerks who encountered him late in life remembered a voice that didn't rise and a command that left no room for argument. Families in certain neighborhoods remembered a knock at the door that meant a week's earnings would be lighter. Every one of those recollections is accurate from the seat it comes from. If you strip away romance, his legacy in the city is practical. He helped push Chicago into adopting tools that outlasted him. Coordination between jurisdictions. Forensic habits that followed metal rather than gossip. Prosecutors willing to build cases from small pieces instead of aiming for single dramatic witnesses who would crumble by cross-examination. The massacre that missed him by minutes helped accelerate a turn toward science, not because he intended it, but because the city needed anchors that fear couldn't break. Calvin Goddard's ballistics work pointed the way. Later detectives picked up that lead in daily practice. A generation of officers learned to trust the unglamorous linkage of records more than the thrilling raid. He never wrote a book. He didn't sit for long interviews that tried to make everything tidy. That silence leaves a space other people have filled with embellishment. He tolerated neither flattery nor pity. The closest he came to summing up his life for public consumption was to present himself as a businessman forced by an unwise law to act tough. That story worked while the law lasted. It doesn't explain the robberies before or after the dry years. The better explanation sits there in the pattern of his days. He was good at certain unlawful crafts. He stuck with them, and the era that rewarded those crafts closed while he still breathed. Walk past the cathedral that watched much of his story, and you see what outlasts men like him. People hurry to work. Bells mark time. Children squeal. Buses kneel for passengers. And the old corners keep their secrets, unless someone goes looking in old files. Those files say that a boy from St. Paul grew into a leader on the north side, helped run liquor during a national experiment, fought a war he could not win, avoided certain trades out of principle, committed many other offenses without blinking, spent long years answering to guards, and died stripped of the wealth his name once suggested. They say that the fear he used to collect money bought him time but not peace. They say that a city learned from his time and moved on even while making movies about it. His life still pulls attention because it holds so many contradictions. He could be devout in form and ruthless in practice. He could be loyal to his drivers and hard on anyone who broke rank. He could admire rules enough to choose some and discard others. He could run a day like a schedule and still lose by arriving late once. He could hold a city at bay for years and end as a man who worried about the location of a chair in a corridor. None of that is unique to him. He just lived it in brighter light than most. If there is a lesson tucked inside the report folders with his name on them, it is not that audacity brings glory. It is that a system designed around fear must run faster and faster to stay ahead of ordinary persistence. Clerks, patrolmen, agents, juries, ledgers, and time form a coalition that doesn't need flash. He lived long enough to see that coalition win. He did not say it out loud. He set his hat on his knee when the chaplain came by and treated the man with respect. In the end, that respect was all he had left to give that looked like grace. Imagine walking north on Clark with coffee in hand, traffic sliding by and small talk hanging in the air, and feeling nothing of the weight once pressed into those blocks. Nothing in the storefront glass tells you a city once measured its nerves by what happened behind a garage door. Nothing in the sound of a bus braking hints at cars that used to idle with engines ready for hard turns. That absence is its own story. Cities forget on purpose, and the forgetting lets them breathe. Somewhere behind that ordinary morning, a life like his runs start to finish. A St. Paul boy who learned the wrong lessons fast. A Chicago organizer who turned liquor bans into a system. A rival to a man who mastered headlines. A survivor of a famous morning. An aging thief who tried to keep speed ahead of consequence. And finally, an inmate who met the end without speeches. After the noise faded, people tried to fix his life in neat categories. Some called him a throwback from a season when Chicago seemed to belong to men with pistols in their coats. Others called him a warning. The record doesn't ask you to choose. It simply lays out what can be verified and, in doing so, lets you see how a particular pattern repeats. Early thefts that set the rhythm of quick cash and short-term thinking. A move into an outfit where schedules, routes, and bribes turned an illegal commodity into a business. An escalation into a feud that punished small mistakes with funerals. A morning defined by a clock that ran a little late. A long decline measured by court dates, thin paydays, and cells. He never denied his part. He explained himself as a businessman shaped by a strange law. That explanation falls apart when you place it next to robberies before the ban, and again after repeal. The more accurate frame is simpler. He was competent at a set of unlawful tasks, rewarded for them for a time, and unwilling or unable to invent a different life when that time ended. He came from a family that gave him faith and a language other than English to knead into the world. French floated around the table of his youth. The parish set the clock. Nuns and priests pushed rules with an insistence as steady as winter. He carried pieces of that formation for life confession, a habit of prayer, a sense that some acts stain the soul worse than others. He drew a line at the sex trade and narcotics and kept to it. That line did not redeem him. It defined his private sense of what he could bear to see in the mirror. On the other side of that line, he demanded cash through intimidation, sketched hijacks, greenlit retaliation in a war that filled headlines, and later ran stick-ups designed to end before anyone had a chance to be a hero. He paid attention to the parts of work no one writes songs about. Lookouts posted in the right place kept crews alive. Drivers who sat still an extra 30 seconds saved situations over and over. Delivery routes woven to avoid a patrol car at a certain hour kept taverns happy. He set those rules and kept them enforced. His temper, which birthed a nickname he disliked, lived mostly behind his eyes. He did not throw fits for show. He cut people loose when they endangered the machine. That coolness, more than bravado, built his authority. People followed him because he paid on time, spoke plainly, and rarely lied about risk. They feared him because he meant it when he said a schedule would be kept and a bill collected. He inhabited a Chicago that was as much politics as pistols. Ward offices and station houses traded favors with men like him even while pastors preached against them. That double life, public scorn and private accommodation, allowed his world to thrive. When a federal case sent his South Side adversary to prison on tax counts, the rules shifted. The outfit learned not to love attention. It learned to squeeze money through contracts and committees. The city taught itself to tolerate the quiet kind of theft that hides in regulated markets. He did not fit that era. He had been shaped to manage trucks and alleys, not men in boardrooms. He reached for a craft he trusted: robberies on roads where repetition makes a person blind. For a while, repetition worked for him again. Then it stopped. Law enforcement saw to that. The massacre that missed him helped turn a taste for raids into a taste for evidence. Ballistics experts compared grooves. Clerks linked rental slips and license numbers. Agents in one state telephoned prosecutors in another and discussed distances rather than legends. That method won. It didn't need dramatic testimony. It needed patience and receipts. By the time it snapped shut around him, he was older than the men taking notes. He could read the end of a chapter without the judge telling him the page number. People who knew only the legend often forget how narrow his advantages were in his prime. He wasn't the richest. He didn't own the police. He didn't sit on film reels tossing coins to children at Christmas. He built his influence on discipline and a willingness to be the man who did not blink first. That worked until losses mounted. O'Banion in a shop meant to smell of roses. Vice on a sidewalk near a church whose bells kept ringing. Drucci after a clash inside a car with police. The 7 in a garage on a morning when frost made the air feel like glass. After those blows, the ledger never balanced the same way again. He had marriages that couldn't hold under the weight of a life that refused to sit still. He had friends who felt safer moving away than staying loyal. He had priests who were kind without becoming accomplices. He had acquaintances who remembered his basic courtesies as much as they remembered his demands. He died with little to his name. The money that had passed through his hands over decades ended up in bribes, legal fees, paydays for drivers and guards, and the constant friction costs of a career that moves from apartment to apartment with a suitcase and a gun. The idea that men like him live large forever is an invention. Most close their eyes far from the blocks that once carried their voices and with far fewer people at the door. His particular war with his South Side counterpart became a shorthand for an era. It simplifies something that was never simple. Those years were a tangle of grudges, opportunists, reformers, and businessmen who knew how to keep an account book clean while everything around it got dirty. He stood for one side, refused certain trades, pushed others, and spent the decades after the war moving along back roads and through small towns, relying on skills he had learned as a teenager in St. Paul. Watch the hands of a clock, study how a person holds a bag, keep the engine running, tell a man what to do in 10 words rather than 50, don't loiter where memory can find you later. Those habits create momentum. They also create cages. When you look at his crimes in sequence, a pattern appears that tells you more than any single sensational day. He started with burglary and petty theft. He rose into organized bootlegging during the dry years, including hijacks of rival shipments and extraction of protection fees from bars that wanted stock and calm. He carried weapons and used them as leverage in a feud that spilled into the open with awful regularity. He faced arrest for conspiracy and vagrancy, charges used as tools by police who needed leverage when witnesses fell silent. After repeal, he returned to robberies, banks, payrolls, messengers' jobs that valued speed over theater. Convictions in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds sent him to prison for long stretches. He died there of illness, not by ambush, not in a getaway car, not on a street where old enemies waited. Quiet, at the end of a long narrowing. He is useful to remember because his choices animate questions that survive the era. How does a city's wink and nod relationship with vice turn young thieves into bosses? What does it cost ordinary people when power is enforced by fear, even if that fear arrives with a handshake and a promise to keep things orderly? What happens to men built for noise when markets move into the quiet of conference rooms? His life answers those questions in detail. It shows that fear is a poor glue. It holds until it doesn't, and then everything comes apart at once. It shows that talent without a legal outlet doesn't become harmless. It becomes efficient at harm. It shows that contrition, even sincere, won't repair what is gone. It can only describe it accurately and sit still with the truth. Stories told after he died tended to frame him as a man tethered to a single mourning. That isn't wrong. That mourning will always cast a shadow over his name. It is just incomplete. He was also the boy ducking school in St. Paul, the apprentice in a florist's shop who listened more than he talked, the organizer who made the North Side run better than it should have under relentless pressure, the rival who mocked charitable displays staged for cameras, the parishioner who knelt in the back of a church and left before anyone could catch him in small talk, the thief who aged into prison meals and hospital cots. Combine those figures and you get something closer to the real man. Not a folk hero, not a monster out of proportion, but a disciplined criminal whose skill set aged badly and whose pride kept him on the road past every reasonable exit. The map of Chicago he walked is gone in important ways. Law cracked down where it could, learned to be incremental, and left room for a different style of underworld that hid inside lawful paperwork. Holy Name's bells still ring. The corner where the florist sold bouquets still pulls wedding parties and mourners through its doors. The garage is long vanished. A city can hold history and still choose to live forward. If he could have stood there in his last year, he might have liked the quiet. He spent too many nights living by noise. Quiet would have felt like a kind of absolution, not in the sense of forgiveness, but in the sense of an end to the drama that strangers insisted on draping over his name. What remains for anyone curious enough to read beyond headlines is the ledger without embellishment. He took money by threat. He organized illegal shipments and guarded them with the possibility of violence. He engineered thefts from rivals who were doing the same to him. He avoided trades he could not stomach and stuck hard to ones he could, regardless of the fear they caused. He tried legitimate work in brief stints and couldn't keep it. He went to prison, came out, and went back because the world had changed and he had not. He died with little more than a reputation that had already begun to shrink. If you listen closely outside an old church on a windy day, you might hear nothing more than leaves tapping stone. That is how most stories end, without a soundtrack, without a last line that explains everything. His ended that way too. The explanations belong to the files and to the people who still care about what cities learn when they survive men like him. Those lessons aren't dramatic. They are practical. Share information. Build cases with small facts. Don't be distracted by spectacle. Understand that charisma and cruelty can wear the same suit. He spent a lifetime exploiting the opposite of those lessons. In the end, those lessons outlived him. A boy left a St. Paul schoolyard, gathered skills that made him dangerous, and followed those skills across decades until they caged him. That is the whole arc, stripped of ornament. It isn't a cautionary tale because he met a spectacular end. It is a caution because it shows how ordinary steps, skipping class, learning to steal, apprenticing to a man who used flowers to mask meetings, trading fear for cash, insisting that you can keep doing what you do after the market has moved on, add up. He kept his hat neat, his shoes shined, his voice even. He broke laws in ways that bent other lives out of shape. He prayed and then planned. He loved control and lost it. He survived a morning meant for him and discovered that survival is not the same as winning. He is gone. The city is not. The record stays, and on quiet days, if you look, you can still see how a single life written in short, relentless strokes can change a place and then be erased by the ordinary that follows. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. George Bugs Moran here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through rivalry, survival, and the life of a man who refused to bow to the empire around him. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.